Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farba. Moscow says it is ready to resume political dialogue with Georgia, but only on its own terms, insisting that its recognition of Abkhazia and South Ossetia is, quote, irreversible. Tbilisi remains firm in response, refusing any normalization until Russia reverses that decision and what Georgia calls the occupation of its territory. And to analyze this political standoff set against the paradox of growing economic ties, we turn to Richard Giragosian, founding director of the Regional Studies Center. Good to have you back on TVP World. Richard, let's start with this very strong declaration here, irreversible recognition. I mean, does this come as a surprise? What does Georgia do next in all this?
Well, no, it's no surprise. In fact, it's both a natural and normal evolution in terms of a Georgian government that is still faced with the lingering legacy of Russia's invasion of Georgia from 2008 and the Russian military occupation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia in northern Georgia. At the same time, this particular Georgian government is much more inwardly focused, repressing its own opposition, moving further and farther away from Europe, and unfortunately increasingly authoritarian. However, regarding this issue, I think the Georgian government is looking for more to stand up to Russia. And there's little in the way of either Russian carrot or stick. Russia remains overwhelmed by everything in its failed invasion of Ukraine. And despite the rhetoric, I think this is rather superficial posturing by both sides.
Okay. So you said Georgia may be looking for more. I mean, this is something, as we know, I mean, this frozen conflict, if you can call it that. But at the same time, Georgia, as you said, is more inward looking. We've seen the terrible protests, the crackdowns on the protesters. Does it any way indicate that Georgia was dubbed to be a country that is, the government at least, is closer and closer to Russia? The Georgian dream is closer to Russia. Is that changing in any way because of this kind of statement or what's happened around the region?
I would argue with the premise. In other words, it's a little too simplistic to see Russia moving away from Europe, and that doesn't automatically make them accommodating or moving closer to Moscow. In other words, it's more nuanced. Yes, the Georgian government is defying its own population, is reversing years of gains in democracy, but that doesn't automatically move them closer to the Russian orbit. And I do think, unfortunately, the Georgians are taking a prompt or a lesson from the Americans in terms of the Trump administration's downgrading of human rights and democracy. But at the same time, when I say Georgia's looking for more, I think the Georgian government is escalating its moves away from Europe because of frustration. It's not gaining the compliments, the rewards from Russia that it thought it would. And a lot of this is because Russia's distracted with its failed invasion of Ukraine, but also because the Georgian government needs to go further in its own mind. But this is a sign of weakness, not strength, of Georgian government insecurity and not confidence. Therefore, we should expect this to get worse before it gets better.
All right. So that's unfortunate what we've been seeing for these last months, that it is getting worse in Georgia, unfortunately. But I want to come on this point of nuance, and that's an interesting one, because if we look on the political side, I mean, that's a tricky area. But at the same time, if we look at the economic, the business side, in fact, the relations between Georgia and Russia have very much been very lucrative. If we look at the economic turnover here, it's 1.3 billion. That's the trade turnover hit in early 2025. I mean, that's just been ratcheting up. So is this a contradiction, or how do we balance the business connection between Georgia and Russia? What does that tell us about this relationship?
Well, Georgia, like Armenia, sees Russian leverage manifesting through economics and trade. The economic domination of Russia with Armenia, with Georgia, surpasses real European Union leverage. What we also see is this particular Georgian government is in power resting on economics. It didn't come to power and it's not governing the country based on foreign policy or even a political stance. It's business interests. And the real leader of the ruling party in Georgia is very much a Georgian from Russia, invested with or endowed with significant Russian-related assets. What this means going forward is everything by the Georgian government is an economic transaction. Everything is driven by a business interest. And that is both an opportunity, but also an obstacle. It's an opportunity because whether the application of sanctions on the Georgian government or other economic responses from the West may provide a degree of leverage or incentive for the Georgian government to actually de-escalate the crisis.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting point. You said that Russia's economic, basically, interactions surpass European leverage in all this. Let's talk about the Europeans for a moment. I mean, those potential membership negotiations have stalled. I mean, they've been basically frozen up until about 2028, if they continue at all. So what do we make of Europe's role? I mean, we've seen them pull back. I mean, initial criticism was levied. There was hope that there would be, they were listened to, but they ultimately were not. So where is Europe's role in all this? What's the relationship now? I mean, it seems to casual observer that they're not that interested anymore, unfortunately, in Georgia. Or where do you see this path going?
Well, I was recently in Brussels several weeks ago, and much of the discussion with EU officials regarding the region and with Georgia centered on the frustration in Brussels with the EU's lack of leverage. The Georgian government simply is no longer interested, despite some signs of the Georgian government's desire to, let's say, consolidate authoritarian power on its own terms. Brussels has much less weight in terms of interest by and in Tbilisi. What this also means, however, is the Georgian government has no place to go. In other words, becoming more lukewarm, softening its strategic aspirations for EU membership is one thing, but there's no place to go. Georgia and its government is not likely to join the Russian-dominated Eurasian Economic Union, for example. Mm-hmm. So I do think as the crisis inward escalates in Georgia, there's little sign of a way out, an exit strategy for Georgia.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, it seems like a rock in a hard place. I mean, we also see the protest movement. We've seen those images. We've seen also the terrible crackdowns, the arrests, spoken over time with many dissidents about the terrible situation there. Where does this leave the protest movement there? I mean, how are the people on the ground? Are they going to continue this? I mean, we have no, let's say, discernible leadership of that movement. But where does that leave that whole process?
Well, on the one hand, it's clear that the crisis domestically in Georgia is simply a cost imposed by the Georgian government itself. It is to blame, and it actually is the main trigger. Having said that, opposition protests, popular movements against a government that's defying its population, needs to now switch to more innovative tactics. Perhaps lessons from 2018 in Armenia, where the Armenians ushered in a rare victory of nonviolent people power. So we should expect the Georgian opposition to actually adopt more civil disobedience tactics. At the same time, the Georgian government is actually making the situation worse for itself because we're past the tipping point, and the Georgian government, by overly repressing its population, has put itself in the corner.
Mm-hmm. Interesting you say tipping point, but I also mentioned Armenia, and I want to get your expertise on the wider region. And essentially, if we look also at Armenia itself, look at Azerbaijan, these countries have also redefined their relationship with Russia. Georgia, is it in the same process right now? I mean, you said they're not fully leaning one way or the other. How does it all factor in altogether?
Well, I think Georgia most notably has lost its previous role as a leader of reform and democracy in the region. Armenia has clearly overtaken Georgia. At the same time, Azerbaijan is much more of a Central Asian style state, a father to son dynasty for a quarter of a century. But what this means is the real turning point to come will be post-Ukraine. We all expect a resurgent Russia trying to regain lost power and influence in the region. And it's going to be a vindictive, vengeful Russia lashing out at her neighbors. And this is why the need for resilience is so important. For Armenia, the outlook is more positive. For countries like Georgia and Azerbaijan, there will be an escalation of tension and then a concerted effort by Moscow to push back and push out the Europeans, but also to try to restore its lost power and position.
Mm-hmm. So that sounds concerning. So let's look at also, I mean, remember our viewers as well that 20% of Georgian territory is currently occupied by the Russian Federation, these regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So what happens with these territories now going into the near term or into the future?
That's a good question because militarily, there are two observations. First is in the context of Russia's failures militarily in Ukraine, what we see is the military foothold in these two occupied regions of Georgia are much less significant. Russia is actually very much distracted from that focus. The other side of the contradiction, however, is post-Ukraine. In the coming years, those Russian-occupied military positions of Georgian territory will be ever more significant because of Nagorno-Karabakh, the previous conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, in which Azerbaijan militarily expelled the Armenian population. We don't have Nagorno-Karabakh as an instrument of leverage for Russia. Therefore, the Russian-occupied regions, the so-called frozen conflicts in Georgia, will be the only game in town for Russia to use as leverage.
Mm-hmm. All right, so if we summarize it all and just give us one sentence, Richard, before we close, the next few months for Georgia, how do you expect it to turn out?
It's going to get worse before it gets better. But we're past the tipping point, and the Georgian government is much more weak than it seems.
All right, we'll see how it plays out, and we'll have the latest. And thank you so much. Always a pleasure. Richard Giragosian there from the Regional Studies Center. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Sasha.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but stay right here on TVP World for more news and commentary. Goodbye.